A 6-year-old black girl walks into a courtroom, hands the judge a note, and moments later, chaos erupts as he calls the cops. What horrifying truth tied to racism could a child so young reveal? The answer will leave you stunned until the very last second. The courtroom buzzed with the usual noise of papers shuffling and attorneys murmuring quietly as the morning hearings began. It was an ordinary day, or so everyone thought. But in a corner of the room, a 6-year-old black girl sat silently, clutching a small, crumpled piece of paper in her tiny hands. She was too young to truly understand the weight of her actions, but the determination in her tear-filled eyes told a different story. Her shoes were scuffed, and her dress, though clean, had seen better days. She sat next to a woman who appeared to be her mother, holding her hand tightly, as though the world outside that courtroom was too much to bear. The mother's face was tense, her jaw set in a way that betrayed her efforts to appear calm. The woman's eyes darted to her daughter, who sat motionless, staring down at the paper she refused to let go of. When the judge finally entered, the room rose in unison. His presence was commanding, his expression neutral, but to the little girl, he must have looked like a giant. She shifted in her seat, her grip tightening on the note. She wasn't sure if this was the right thing to do. What if she got in trouble? What if no one believed her? The tension between the little girl and her mother hung heavy in the air. "You can do this, baby," her mother whispered softly, her voice cracking under the strain of her own emotions. The girl turned her big brown eyes toward her mother, nodding silently. As the proceedings began, cases were called one by one. People came and went, their lives condensed into a few minutes of legal jargon. But the little girl barely heard any of it. Her heart raced as her moment drew nearer. Her small hands trembled as she clutched the note tighter, as if afraid it might slip away. Finally, her mother squeezed her hand and whispered, "It's time." The girl stood slowly, her legs shaky, as she began walking toward the judge. The room seemed to still for a moment as this small, unassuming child approached the bench. Whispers rippled through the crowd, and all eyes turned to the little girl who was now standing before the judge. "Your Honor." Her voice quivered, barely above a whisper. She stretched out her hand, offering the crumpled note. The judge furrowed his brows, but leaned forward, gently taking it from her tiny fingers. The courtroom fell eerily silent as the judge unfolded the note. His expression was unreadable at first, but as his eyes scanned the words, his face began to change. His stern composure cracked ever so slightly, his mouth tightening, and his hands gripping the paper as if he had just uncovered something unimaginable. Without a word, the judge straightened in his seat, looked out into the courtroom, and made a sharp motion toward the bailiff. "Call the police. Now." Gasps rippled through the room as confusion and fear swept over the crowd. The little girl stood frozen, her eyes wide and wet with tears, as if she knew her note had changed everything. Her mother rushed forward, pulling her into a tight embrace, whispering, "You were so brave, my baby. So brave." But what was written in that note? What could a 6-year-old possibly reveal that would send a seasoned judge into immediate action? As the courtroom swirled with murmurs and chaos, the little girl's quiet courage and the haunting truth within that piece of paper had set events into motion, events no one in that room would ever forget. The room was still buzzing with murmurs as the police were summoned. Officers had already begun arriving at the courthouse, their sharp uniforms a stark contrast to the warm human moment that had just unfolded. Meanwhile, the judge sat frozen, his face pale, still gripping the crumpled note as though it held the weight of the world. But his silence was no match for the tension that hung heavy in the room. The little girl's mother sat her down on the bench near the front of the courtroom, brushing a hand gently over her daughter's small braids. "It's okay now, baby. You did the right thing," she whispered. But her voice trembled. It was the kind of tremble that comes from years of holding back tears, from carrying too many burdens no one else could see. As the girl clung tightly to her mother, her small frame shaking, the woman glanced toward the judge, her face a mixture of exhaustion and defiance. She knew the risks of what they had just done. Speaking out, especially as a black woman in a system that often ignored voices like hers, was no small act. But this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about her daughter. The mother's mind raced back to the events that led them to this moment. It wasn't long ago that she had first found the signs. Bruises that couldn't be explained. Fear in her daughter's eyes when she spoke about someone she had trusted. Nightmares that left the little girl screaming, her cries echoing in the stillness of their small apartment. At first, she didn't want to believe it. The weight of what her daughter was telling her was too much to bear. But deep down she knew. A mother always knows. She had begged for help, pleaded with school officials, neighbors, and anyone who would listen. But they either dismissed her concerns or offered empty promises to look into it. Nothing changed. The system that was supposed to protect them only made her feel smaller, more helpless. And then there was the man. The one who her daughter had whispered about with trembling lips. The one who had power, authority, and connections that made him untouchable. The man whose shadow loomed over their lives, suffocating any hope of escape. The note was her last resort. The mother had spent sleepless nights helping her daughter write it. She couldn't go through the proper channels. She'd tried that, and it had failed her. So they wrote down every painful detail, every truth that the world seemed determined to ignore. They poured their fear, their anger, and their hope into that small piece of paper. And then she had told her daughter, "You're braver than I've ever been. You're going to hand this to someone who can help us." Now, sitting in the courtroom, she felt a flicker of doubt creeping in. Had she done the right thing? What if no one believed them? What if this only made things worse? Her thoughts were interrupted as an officer approached the judge, who handed him the note with a grim expression. The officer scanned the paper quickly, his face darkening with each passing second. He glanced toward the little girl and her mother, then back to the judge. "We need to act immediately," the officer muttered under his breath. The judge nodded, his jaw tight. The mother tightened her grip on her daughter, who was now clutching her stuffed bear, a comfort she hadn't let go of since the nightmares began. She looked at her little girl, whose wide eyes stared at the police officers moving around the courtroom. "Mommy," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. "Are we safe now?" The mother's throat tightened. She wanted to say yes, to promise her daughter that the nightmare was over, but she knew the battle was far from finished. "We're going to be, baby. We're going to be." The officers began ushering people out of the courtroom as whispers grew louder. The note had sparked something bigger than anyone in that room had anticipated. And as the mother held her child close, tears streaming down her face, she knew that what had started with a single crumpled piece of paper was about to ignite a fire no one could extinguish. The courtroom emptied quickly, leaving only the officers, the judge, and the small family sitting near the front. The mother's hands trembled as she held her daughter close, watching every movement in the room like a hawk. She could feel the weight of what they had revealed pressing down on her, but she knew there was no turning back now. Across the room, the lead officer, a tall man with a steely expression, stood by the judge, quietly discussing the contents of the note. His face hardened as the judge whispered something, pointing to the paper. The officer's grip on his radio tightened before he turned and barked an order to his team. "We need more officers at this location immediately. Secure all access points." The mother's heart raced as she caught fragments of their conversation. What was happening? Was the note enough? Or would it be dismissed, just like every other attempt she had made to be heard? The lead officer finally turned toward her, his sharp eyes locking onto hers. "Mom, we're going to need you to come with us," he said firmly. She clutched her daughter tighter. "Why? What's going on?" Her voice was strong, but inside, fear bubbled to the surface. "It's for your safety," the officer replied, his voice softening just slightly. "What your daughter wrote in this note, It's serious. Very serious. We need to make sure both of you are protected while we investigate." The mother nodded hesitantly, her mind racing. She had spent years feeling invisible, as if her voice didn't matter, as if her struggles were too small to be acknowledged. And now, in this moment, she could sense the gravity of the situation, the weight of her daughter's words finally being taken seriously. Meanwhile, the judge stood at the bench, the note still in his hand. He glanced down at it once more, his expression a mix of shock and sorrow. The words written on the crumpled paper revealed a story no child should ever have to tell. The note described a man, powerful, respected, and untouchable in the eyes of many. He was someone the community trusted, someone who had used his position of authority to hide the worst kind of evil. The girl's note didn't just name him, it detailed what he had done. Her young, shaky handwriting told of secret meetings, whispered threats, and moments of terror she couldn't fully understand, but would never forget. The judge handed the note to the officer once again. "This isn't just a case of misconduct," he said, his voice low. "It's far worse than that. We're looking at something systemic, a pattern of abuse and cover-ups." The officer nodded grimly. "And he's still out there." The words hit the mother like a punch to the stomach. She had done everything she could to protect her daughter, kept her close, stayed silent, tried to move on. But none of it had been enough. The man they feared had ties everywhere, the police, the courts, even local politicians. If he found out what they had done, there would be consequences. "Mommy," the little girl whispered, breaking her mother's thoughts. "I don't want him to hurt us anymore." The mother knelt in front of her daughter, cupping her small face in her hands. "He won't, baby, I promise you. We're going to stop him." Her voice trembled with equal parts fear and determination. The lead officer approached, speaking in a low tone. "We're moving both of you to a safe location. He can't know where you are until we have him in custody." The mother nodded again, her grip tightening around her daughter's small hand. She glanced at the judge, who gave her a slight nod of reassurance. But there was something in his eyes, a recognition of the danger they were in, and the long road ahead to make things right. As they were escorted out of the courtroom and into the harsh light of the day, the mother felt a spark of hope she hadn't felt in years. Her daughter's voice had finally been heard, and now there was no stopping what would come next. But even as the police car sped away, taking them to an unknown destination, the fear lingered. The man who had caused so much pain still walked free, and she knew he wouldn't go down without a fight. Somewhere he was watching, and he would know that his time was running out. The police car sped through the city, weaving through streets as the little girl and her mother sat silently in the back seat. The hum of the engine was the only sound as tension filled the air. The mother clutched her daughter close, her mind spinning with fear and questions. What if he found them? What if no one could stop him? The lead officer, seated in the passenger seat, spoke into his radio. "All units, we have reason to believe the suspect is armed and dangerous. We need full surveillance on his known locations. This man cannot slip through our fingers." Meanwhile, somewhere across town, the man they feared sat in his office. It was a polished space, lined with bookshelves and expensive furniture that spoke to his power and status. He was the type of man who walked into a room and commanded attention, who smiled for the cameras at charity events while hiding the darkness that lived behind closed doors. But today, there was no smile. His phone buzzed on the desk, and he picked it up with an impatient scowl. "What's the update?" he barked into the receiver. The voice on the other end hesitated. "Sir, there's been an incident in court." The man's eyes narrowed. "What kind of incident?" "There was a note. From the girl. She gave it to the judge." For a moment, silence hung in the air. The man's grip tightened on the phone, his knuckles turning white. "What did it say?" he demanded. "We don't know the full details yet, but the cops are involved. They've taken the mother and daughter somewhere safe." The man stood, pacing the room, his mind racing. He had spent years building his reputation, carefully crafting an image of trust and respect. No one had dared to challenge him, until now. And now it wasn't just anyone. It was a 6-year-old girl. "How much do they know?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. "Enough to open an investigation," the voice replied nervously. "We've got a problem, sir." The man slammed the phone down, his chest heaving with anger. He wasn't going to let everything he had built fall apart because of a child. He knew how the system worked. He had spent years manipulating it, ensuring that people like him were untouchable. But this time, something was different. Back in the police car, the mother looked at her daughter, who sat quietly with her bear clutched in her arms. "Mommy," the girl whispered, her voice trembling. "Is he going to find us?" Tears pricked the mother's eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. "No, baby," she said firmly. "We're safe now. The police are going to stop him. You're so brave for what you did today." The little girl nodded, but her small hand shook as she held onto her mother's arm. The lead officer turned to look at them from the front seat. "Mom, I won't sugarcoat this," he said. "This man is powerful, and he's dangerous. He's got connections that go deep, and people like him don't go down without a fight. But I promise you this, we're not going to stop until we take him down." The mother nodded, her jaw tightening. "You'd better not," she said, her voice steely. "Because if you don't, no one will." Back in his office, the man made a decision. He reached for his phone and made another call. "I want eyes on them," he said coldly. "Find them, now." As the day turned to evening, the police secured the mother and daughter in a safe house on the outskirts of the city. Officers patrolled the perimeter, their radios crackling with updates on the investigation. The mother sat at the small kitchen table, watching her daughter color in a notebook, trying to find comfort in the simple act of drawing. But even in this quiet moment, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The man's reach was long, and his silence was dangerous. He wouldn't just let them walk away. Somewhere in the darkness, he was plotting his next move, and the mother knew they were running out of time. The safe house was eerily quiet that night, save for the occasional crackle of police radios outside. Inside, the mother sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the peeling paint on the wall, lost in thought. Her daughter was curled up beside her, her tiny frame rising and falling with every soft breath. For the first time in weeks, the little girl had fallen asleep without crying, but her mother's mind raced with fear and what-ifs. Across the room, the lead officer knocked lightly on the doorframe. "Ma'am, can I come in?" She nodded, motioning for him to keep his voice down so as not to wake her daughter. The officer stepped inside, his face grim but determined. "We've got a team working round the clock. His connections are deep, but we've already found enough to start pulling at the threads. This note your daughter gave us, it's more than enough to blow this wide open." Her throat tightened as she glanced at her daughter. "So, what happens now?" The officer shifted his weight, lowering his voice. "The judge authorized an immediate warrant for his arrest. It's risky, he's slippery, and he's got people protecting him. But this time, we've got a shot. Your daughter's bravery made that possible." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, shaking her head. "Do you know how long I've tried to make someone listen? Do you know how many doors I've knocked on? How many people I begged for help? And now suddenly it's enough because a note from a 6-year-old made them pay attention." The officer met her gaze, his expression softening. "I won't lie to you. The system isn't perfect. It fails people like you far too often. But you've done something extraordinary. You've forced us to face the truth. And I promise we're not letting this man get away." She swallowed hard and nodded. "I've heard promises before, officer. I hope you mean it." Meanwhile, across town, the man paced in his dimly lit office, his phone glued to his ear. His usual calm exterior was cracking as reports flooded in about police movements and warrants. "What do you mean they're closing in? They've got nothing," he snarled at the person on the other end. "They've got the note, sir," the voice replied nervously. "And the girl's testimony. It's enough to implicate you. They're not letting this go. The man slammed his fist on the desk, knocking over a glass of whiskey. He had spent years building walls around himself, ensuring no one could touch him. But now, a 6-year-old girl had pierced those walls. He stared out the window, his jaw tightening. He wasn't going to go down quietly. Back at the safe house, the mother and daughter sat together at the small kitchen table the next morning. The little girl scribbled in her coloring book while her mother sipped on a cup of lukewarm coffee, trying to push away the lingering fear. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, and her heart leapt. She glanced at the officer stationed inside, who quickly moved to answer. "It's us," a familiar voice called out. The door opened to reveal the lead officer, his face lit with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. "We've got him," he said, his voice firm. The mother froze, her coffee cup trembling in her hand. "What? You caught him?" The officer nodded. "Early this morning, he tried to run, but we had teams surrounding his property. He's in custody now, and with the evidence we have, including your daughter's note, there's no way he's getting out of this." The mother exhaled sharply, tears spilling from her eyes as relief and disbelief washed over her. She knelt down, pulling her daughter into a tight hug. "Mommy?" the little girl whispered. "Is it over?" Her mother smiled through her tears, brushing her daughter's hair back. "Not yet, baby, but it's a start." The news of the arrest broke later that day, sending shockwaves through the community. The man's name was plastered across every headline, his pristine reputation shattered as details of his crimes came to light. The bravery of a 6-year-old girl, who had refused to stay silent, had exposed years of corruption and abuse. But the story didn't end there. As the trial loomed, the mother knew there was still a fight ahead. The man would use every resource at his disposal to try and escape justice, and they would need to remain strong. Still, for the first time in years, hope began to bloom. The mother and daughter's courage had ignited a spark, one that couldn't be extinguished. And as the world learned the truth, one thing became clear. No matter how powerful the man had seemed, he was no match for the truth and the unshakable bravery of a little girl.